Who's the Beatdown is a phrase that originates from Mike Flores' famous 1999 article of the same name. Flores was a professional Magic the Gathering player and wrote several articles discussing his philosophy on how to perform well at competitive Magic events. However, some people who have never even played the game of Magic are familiar with this phrase. That's because the core concept of Flores' article transcends Magic the Gathering, and it even transcends card games. This video will be a discussion on how this foundational article can be applied to Yugioh, specifically Edison format. The first thing necessary to understand who's the beatdown is to have a solid grasp of what the term beatdown is meant to entail. Flores writes, if you are the beatdown deck, you have to kill your opponent faster than he can kill you. If you're the control deck, you have to weather the early beatdown and get into a position where you can gain card advantage. In Magic the Gathering, it's easier to identify the distinction between beatdown and control, since the game has a resource system, mana. Mana is generated by lands, and players can only play one land per turn. A prototypical beatdown deck will usually have a high proportion of cards that need very little mana in order to be played. While these cards aren't very powerful in a vacuum, the benefit of including them in your deck is that you're able to begin playing sooner than your opponent. While the control player is stuck holding onto cards that require more setup to be played, the beatdown player can begin their attack and limit the number of turns the opponent has to get their deck's engine going. However, if the control player survives the early assault from their opponent, the tides shift in their favor. The control player typically needs more time to put their cards into play. However, the payoff is usually worth it. Control decks are built to generate card advantage and win a battle of attrition, and with their near unlimited resources in the late game, the outcome of the duel becomes a foregone conclusion. This quality is referred to as inevitability. Yugioh doesn't have a traditional resource system, but despite that, the dynamic of beatdown versus control still plays out. Some decks are built to swarm the field with monsters and apply pressure to the opponent's life points immediately, while other decks need several turns to set up their graveyard, rely on slower cards like flip effect monsters, and have a higher concentration of monsters that need to be normal summoned. At the most basic level, the beatdown deck has the most success when the duel ends quickly, and the control deck performs best in games that last longer. So if the concept of beatdown is clear, what did Flores mean by asking, who's the beatdown, and how is the answer helpful? Well, keep in mind that not every matchup will be Blackwing versus Quickdraw Plant. Usually the two decks won't have such a stark contrast in their objectives. Flores writes that, in similar deck versus similar deck matchups, one deck has to play the role of beatdown, and the other deck has to play the role of control. Even if you generally consider your deck to be a control deck, it's important to recognize that your actions in a duel shouldn't be aligned with how your deck is classified in the context of the broader metagame. They should be aligned with where your deck belongs in the context of that specific duel. Let's take Value Turbo as an example. The Value deck is able to generate free resources when Raikou mills Blackwing monsters, or when the opponent is forced to spend their cards outing a threat like Sirocco or Armed Wing and sending it to the graveyard, where it can then be recycled and used as fuel for an even more threatening body on board. Additionally, Value Turbo has tools to slow the opponent down to their pace. Chief among them is Royal Oppression. These traits often allow the Value player to outgrind their opponent and win a duel that goes long, since the opponent's defenses are depleted sooner than the Value deck runs out of threats. In this kind of duel, Value Turbo is the deck that has inevitability. However, in a duel against a Frog deck, it's unlikely that the Value player will win by extending the game as long as possible. Value's resource generation can't keep up with the literally infinite resources afforded to the Frog player by Trueborn Frog. The role that the Value player needs to adopt is that of the beatdown deck. Most of the power plays in Frog decks are attached to monsters that use up the normal summon. Caius, Junk Synchron, and Deep Sea Diva can't all be played on the same turn. Like the Magic player being limited to their one land per turn, the Frog player is limited to their one normal summon. This, combined with Trueborn Frog's restriction on back row, means that most of the Frog player's cards will remain in their hand. Other decks have no such problem. Like the beatdown decks in Magic the Gathering, they're able to fill the field with cards in the form of monsters as well as spells and traps. This speed allows them to rush down the Frog player and overwhelm them. For the Value player, Dark Grepher can immediately convert a card in hand into a 2300 beater on field. Cards like Burial from the Different Dimension and Royal Oppression adopt different roles in the matchup against Frogs. Burial is often used to replenish the graveyard with resources and maintain the never-ending stream of Blackwing Synchros. But against a control deck like Frogs, Burial is used to apply immediate pressure by allowing the value player to put out as many bodies on field as possible and end the duel before the Frog player's advantage gets out of hand. Against beatdown decks, Royal Oppression is used to prevent the opponent from extending on their aggressive pushes. But versus Frogs, it shuts down the opponent's defensive options. Substitute can't be used to establish dupe block, and Battle Fader won't be able to protect the Frog player's life points. Understanding one's role as either the beatdown or the control deck is about identifying the time-sensitive advantages and disadvantages that your deck has when compared to your opponent's. And once you've identified the role your deck wants to play in the matchup, it's on the pilot to make gameplay decisions that facilitate the execution of that game plan. In Mike Flores' assessment, the player who misassigns himself is inevitably the loser. In the years following the publishing of the original Who's the Beatdown article, many prominent figures in Magic the Gathering gave their own interpretation of the concepts explored by Flores in 1999. Chief among them was pro player and future Hall of Famer Z. Mauschwitz, who wrote his own piece expanding on the core ideas of Flores' article, which he appropriately titled Who's the Beatdown 2. A key idea that Mauschwitz stressed was that the role of the beatdown and control are not tied strictly to deck choice, and they are constantly in flux. In Magic, what is important is constantly changing. As what is important changes, players have to adjust to that by taking on different roles. In a sense, Magic can be looked at as the quest to obtain roles, and those roles are highly flexible at every level. They can change not only between matchups, decks, and games, but also between turns. Just because a Quick Draw player sits down to play against a Diva Hero player doesn't mean that the Quick Draw player will be playing the control role for the entirety of the match. There are likely to be games or specific times within games that the Diva Hero deck is the one with inevitability. If the Quick Draw player isn't paying attention to the shift in dynamic as the duel progresses and simply proceeds with their usual playstyle, they'll be doing themselves a disservice. Who's the Beatdown 2 also explored how the role of beatdown and control can be influenced by the side deck. Many of the best sideboards are designed not only to put in good cards against an opponent, but to change or even reverse your overall strategy. Part of that is often changing the role you intend to play. An example of a popular side deck card that allows the pilot to adopt a different playstyle in games 2 and 3 is Soul Release. Usually when playing against Frogs, one has to overwhelm the opponent rather than attempting to keep up with the opponent in a resource game. However, if you're able to banish both Treeborns from the opponent's grave, you can afford to take things slower, not overcommitting into Gores or Dark Dust Spirit, and that's made possible by Soul Release. Card games are, by nature, full of variance. A skilled player needs to be able to assess a given situation and understand the things that each deck needs to achieve in order to be successful. There will almost always be some imbalance in the plays available to each player, even in a mirror match, and it's important to make that imbalance work to one's advantage. For example, let's examine a Blackwing mirror. Duelist 1 goes first with a hand that consists of Shura, 2 Black Whirlwinds, Vayu, Blizzard, and Sirocco. Duelist 2 opens with Sirocco, Bora, Gale, Book, Solemn, and the 6th card is Bottomless. Despite the fact that this is a mirror match and the two players could be playing the exact same 40 cards, the two players have two extremely disparate game plans. Duelist 1 has an unstoppable stream of resources coming from the Black Whirlwinds. Duelist 2 has no chance of winning a long game, unless those spells are dealt with extremely quickly. Duelist 2 needs to recognize that the most clear path to the victory is by using their back row to prevent the opponent from getting started, and attempt to rush down the opponent and reduce their life points to 0 as quickly as possible. Solemn might be used to negate a Blackwing normal summon, rather than holding onto it for a blowout card like Brain Control, Torrential Tribute, or Mirror Force. Usually these cards are impactful enough to be given a great deal of respect, but in a situation like this, the cost of playing around those cards could actually be greater than the cost of playing into them by expending Solemn early. Running into a Mirror Force is trivial when you would have lost anyway had you played intentionally to avoid it. It's easy to treat cards or interactions as having a fixed value. Using Mirror Force on a lone Armageddonite sounds like an inefficient use of one's cards on the surface. But if that Armageddonite was the only thing blocking you from reaching lethal on your turn, there's nothing more useful you could be doing with that copy of Mirror Force. Sometimes it might feel bad to spend Solemn Judgment on the normal summon of Neos Alias, but if your only way of winning is by running the opponent out of monsters, that Alias could be worth far more than just half your life points. As Mauschwitz put it, the whole idea of Who's the Beatdown isn't that you need to know which of these two roles you're taking, it's that you need to know what each player needs to accomplish to win.